بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So this is the fasl في بيان مقتضى مطلق الأمر في حكم التكرار. Is that right? So that's the chapter that we're going to look at, or it's a section rather than a chapter. It's a section, not a chapter. And we're going to be looking at clarifying the requirement of repetition in when you have an amr. So when you have an amr, does it mean there's takrar, which is repetition, or is it only for once? Okay, so this chapter really discusses that. Let's go through it. Let me give you a mapping of the chapter, or the section rather, and then in the next episode, in the next lesson, we'll go through the details. So the first thing is to do with commands and repetition. There's 2 points here. When you have an unrestricted form of a command, an amr, or as somebody pointed out, a better translation might be the imperative, it does not inherently necessitate repetition. Yeah. So an unrestricted form of an imperative, an amr, does not inherently necessitate repetition. There's nothing inherently about it that necessitates takrar. Okay? It implies rather the minimal fulfillment of the action. Yeah? Unless there is evidence that requires you to do more. Very, very important. This will be very, very useful if you could study basic Usul al-fiqh texts, where they talk about, you have these scenarios in Usul al-Shashi about when a husband says to his wife, if you enter the house, if you enter the house, you're divorced. So is it just the one time she enters the house, or is it every time she enters the house? Okay. The second thing here for commands and repetition is that if a command is tied to a condition or a description, the repetition of that condition or description may imply a repetition of the action. So it's to do with what is it tied to, right? So that's really, really important because through the examples we will see over the next few episodes, we will go through that. As always, there are scholarly opinions. So this is the second thing. The Hanafis, for them, as we will see, is that the command does not necessitate repetition nor imply it unless it's specifically indicated by additional evidence. That's the Hanafi position, if you like. Our friends, the Shafi'is, they would say that the command again does not inherently necessitate repetition, but there's a farq. They say it allows for the possibility depending on context or attached evidence. So there's a slight difference which we will uncover. There are alternative views, of course. Some claim that the unrestricted command necessitates repetition unless evidence prevents it. So this is a very different position. But this view, as we will see, is going to be disputed by our author, Imam al-Sarakhsi. So that's the second point. The third point is this analogy with language. And we will see that commands resemble other forms of speech. So for instance, when we say enter, that could mean once, or it could mean enter multiple times. But what we will say is that even when we say that in language, when someone says enter, they don't mean keep entering, right? What they really mean is that enter once. So even in language, we have this understanding that the minimal requirement is obligatory unless we have further evidence, because you would say to somebody, enter, and I want you to enter again. Yeah. Then you have something about singular commands. So if you say to someone, buy me an iPhone, that would be understood as specific to one instance unless it's explicitly stated otherwise. Very, very simple, yeah? Number 4, you'll see that there is a comparison with the prohibition, the Nahy. Now, in this section, you'll see there is a difference between how an Amr is understood and how a Nahy is understood. In the previous videos, we talked about how they are mirroring. That doesn't necessarily happen here. So, what do I mean by that? A prohibition inherently generalizes. So, if you say, do not give charity, it means don't give charity to all forms of charity. That's what Imam Sarakhsi research was. And unlike commands, it restricts all forms of the prohibited action unless otherwise specified. So it's different to an Number 5, what if you have commands with numbers or what we call modifiers? So when a number or condition comes, for example, divorce her thrice, 3 times, or somebody says with a condition like divorce her according to the Sunnah, right? This is going to be obviously a number or a modifier that's attached to a command that will obviously alter the command's meaning, but not the inherent form of it. Okay? But without any modifiers, the command will apply to a single instance. So we apply the modifier to the extent that we need it to happen. So, let me give you some specific examples before we dive into the text in the next episode. If you have a conditional command, if you enter the house, you are divorced. You see this in like Usul al-Saki, right? You have these examples. If you do this, this is the outcome. As a consequence of our theorization of how the command works, it will only result in a single divorce, regardless of repeated occurrences of the condition. So for us, it's only understood as once. If she goes in and out a few times, doesn't matter. There's also a example that will come about the Prophet ﷺ when he gives a clarification on the Hajj. When he said, if I said every year, it would have been obligatory. We'll come across that example. And this example demonstrates that commands do not inherently imply repetition. Why would the Prophet ﷺ say that? Right? Why would he say that? Number 7, there's also, we'll see examples of reasoning and logic here. So if you think about it, so this is not to do language. Remember, Hanafis, we use language theory, we think about things as well. So if you think about it, compliance with a command once is sufficient to discharge the obligation. And any additional instances of the same act would be considered voluntary, not part of the original command. And this ties to the idea that commands only require repetition when supported by evidence or modifiers such as time-based requirements. So for example, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ is tied to the idea of specific times. When that time comes, then you perform the prayer. So if you want to simplify what we discussed so far, number 1, commands are minimal by default. If you want to kind of summarize it in a sentence, yeah. So when I say do this, it generally means do it once, unless I say something like do it every day, do it 5 times, right? So it requires extra qualification if you want someone to do it more than once. That makes sense. As for conditions and repetition, if a command is tied to some sort of condition, if you enter this house, there's a divorce, the command would apply once for a fulfillment of the condition, according to us. Okay. So the example I gave, obviously, is the example of the woman entering the house, the wife. It's one divorce. If she comes back out and does it again, it's not a second one, it's only one. Yeah. It only results in one divorce. When we compare, as we will see inshallah ta'ala in next session, we will compare commands to prohibitions. Imam Sarakhsi will do this. And what I said was that prohibitions don't do this, or they apply broadly to all forms of the prohibited action unless specified otherwise. It's different to Amr. Nahy is different. Commands, in contrast, apply to the minimum required unless there's evidence and clarification given otherwise. So prohibitions to all, imperatives to only the minimum amount. Yeah, and Imam Sarakhsi will show us why that is the case. Very important difference, subtle difference between an Amr and a Nahy. Obviously, we've talked about modifiers. When you're adding specifics like numbers or descriptions, that obviously changes the meaning of the command. So if I say divorce her 3 times, that explicitly means three divorces. But if I say divorce her, the default is 1. Okay. So the specifiers are important. Anything that is fulfilled after the command is considered a voluntary act. Yeah. So once you fulfill the command, similar acts to it are considered voluntary. So if someone prays the required units of Dhuhr, and he prays more afterwards, these extra prayers are voluntary, not obligatory. Yeah. And of course, we'll go through the Hajj example. The Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked, he clarified that Hajj is obligatory only once in a lifetime, unless explicitly stated otherwise annually. And so from the Hadith you understand this as well, that it's only once in a lifetime, to clarify this, right? So this shows through this Hadith that commands do not inherently imply repetition unless specified. So what is the upshot of all of this? What is the conclusion? Commands imply the least amount required unless evidence or modifiers suggest otherwise, and fulfilling a command once discharges the obligation, while repetition is voluntary or due to some other evidence. That's like the entire, this is the entire section summarized for you. Everything else now is the details. I'm just going to, for the barakah, inshallah, I'm just going to do the first few lines. So at least that way we've started it. So you should be used to the style of Imam Sarakhsi. He gives a few lines, different positions, and then he dives into the discussion. So he says, "As-sahihu min madhhabi ulama'ina," that the correct opinion of our scholars. When he says, when he obviously uses the word madhhab, ulama'ina, he's talking about the intro madhhab within the Hanafi madhhab. So immediately when he says as-sahih, he's telling you what, that there's debates on this. Yeah, it's not like this is the only position. That, and this is important, this can be highlighted, أن صيغة الأمر لا توجب التكرار ولا تحتمله. So he mentions 2 things, that the form of a command does not necessitate repetition, nor does it imply it. Yeah. So he's talking about a sayra, the form of the command or the amr. So it can't handle multiplicity, right? Like when you say do, it's not, there's no imkan, there's no possibility of multiple things doing just one. But he says, ولكن الأمر بالفعل يقتضي أدنى ما يكون من جنسه على احتمال الكل. So the command to perform an action requires the least occurrence of its type, of its genus. Yeah. While allowing for the possibility of all of it. Yeah. But he says, ولا يكون موجبا للكل إلا بدليل. You need a dalil to tell you to go beyond what is necessary. Yeah. And then he says, وقال بعض مشايخنا, some of our teachers say, هذا إن لم يكن معلقا بشرط ولا مقيد بوصف. This only applies if it's not made a conditional by a conditional or a restricted by a description. If it is, then its implication is repetition with the repetition of what it is restricted by. Yeah. So this is another position. So what does this passage do? It obviously tells us 4 things to my mind. A command in its linguistic form. So he's just, look how he's doing it. he's looking at linguistics first. The linguistic form does not inherently require repetition. The sila itself linguistically does not require repetition. He's not looking at any other arguments. Let's look at the structure of language first. This is why I say usul al-fiqh is about understanding language theory. And he says that it obligates at least one instance of the command action, though it may allow for more. That's because of what we said, that you need to have other indicators that tell you. And to say that you want to have total obligation, which is this idea doing the action in full or repeatedly, requires additional evidence. Okay. However, if the command is qualified or conditional, like tied to a specific situation or description, then repetition is implied whenever that condition or qualifier recurs. That's all it is. Yeah. And so we're looking at a distinction between the linguistic form and legal implication. This is something that we will look at, inshallah ta'ala. What we will do is in the next lesson, we will build on this. We'll introduce the Shafi'is and other madhahib, but the entire section has been summarized for you, and that's all you need to remember, really. And all of this is now Imam al-Sarakhsi working through the details of his chapter.